not flinch. I did not look away. I just stood there in the middle of the conference room, holding my coffee with both hands and let him finish. My manager, the man who had been CCing my boss on every minor mistake I made for the past 8 months, finally ran out of words. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and waited for me to cry, or apologize, or beg. That's what he expected. That's what he always expected from me. I took a slow sip of my coffee. "Okay," I said. "Are we done?" He blinked. He hadn't planned for that. I should back up. My name is not important. What matters is that I was 29 years old. I'd spent 4 years building the client analytics division of Courtwell Financial from a 2-person team into a department of 11, and I was 3 weeks away from the biggest presentation of my career, a contract worth $4.2 million, a contract I had written, pitched, and negotiated almost entirely on my own, the kind of deal that would have gotten anyone else a promotion and a press release. But I wasn't anyone else. I was the woman who made the numbers work while the men in the room got credit for them. His name was Donovan. My manager, he had joined Courtwell 18 months before as a lateral hire, someone's college friend, everyone whispered, and had immediately set about reorganizing the analytics division in ways that made very little sense unless you understood that what he was actually doing was making himself look necessary. He moved meetings, he renamed reports, he inserted himself into client calls he had no business being on. And he watched me, constantly. I think he knew from the very beginning that I was the one actually running things, and I think that scared him. The morning everything broke open was a Tuesday. A cold, flat Tuesday in February, the kind of day where the sky looks like a ceiling. I had gotten in early, like I always did, to finalize the deck for the Henderson account presentation. The office was quiet. Just me, the hum of the heating system, and the particular stillness that comes before everyone else arrives. I was on my 3rd revision of slide 14 when Donovan walked in. He didn't say good morning. He sat across from me, put his phone face down on the table, which he always did when he wanted you to feel like you had his full attention, which was never actually true, and he said, "I need to talk to you about the Henderson pitch." "I'm working on it right now," I said. "Yeah," he paused. "See, here's the thing. After talking it over with upper management, we've decided to restructure the presentation team." I set my coffee down very slowly. "We're going to have Lawrence take point on the client-facing side," he said. "He's got more years in front of C-suite audiences. It will be a better look for the firm." Lawrence had been at Courtwell for 6 months. Lawrence had sat in on exactly 2 of the Henderson calls. Lawrence had once asked me to explain what a retention rate was. "I built this account," I said. "You did a lot of great work behind the scenes," Donovan said, "and I want you to understand the specific way he said it, like he was giving me a compliment, like I should be grateful. But client relations is a different skill set, and at the end of the day, we have to put our best foot forward." I looked at him for a long moment. "Is this because I pushed back on the timeline last week?" I asked. He smiled. The kind of smile that doesn't reach anywhere near the eyes. "This is a business decision. I hope you can be professional about it." Professional, there it was. I picked my coffee back up. I nodded once, and I said, "I understand." He seemed relieved. He slapped the table lightly with both palms, the way men do when they think a difficult conversation has gone well, and he said, "Great, I knew you'd get it." He stood up to leave. "Donovan," I said. He turned. "The Henderson files are on the shared drive, under a folder called Andrea's Documents, just in case Lawrence needs to find them." He left. I finished my coffee. I did not cry, because I already knew what he didn't. "I need to tell you about my husband. We'd been married 14 months at that point. We met at a conference, not the romantic movie version where eyes meet across a crowded room, but the real version, which is that we were both hiding from a particularly bad panel discussion in the same stairwell and ended up talking about supply chain logistics for an hour and a half. He was quietly brilliant in the way that people who don't need to prove anything usually are. He worked in financial compliance consulting. Specifically, he helped companies audit their internal data systems for regulatory gaps. He'd been consulting for Courtwell Financial for 2 years before I started working there. He had, in the course of that consulting work, documented a series of data management irregularities in Courtwell's client reporting system, irregularities that, depending on how a regulator chose to interpret them, could look a lot like selective disclosure. He had reported these findings to the company's general counsel 18 months ago. They had thanked him, paid his invoice, and quietly buried the report. He still had every copy. I had never planned to use that. Genuinely. It felt like a line I didn't want to cross. We had talked about it once, early on when I first started noticing the pattern with Donovan, and my husband had said simply, "The information exists. What you do with it is up to you." And then he had gone back to making dinner. But sitting in that conference room at 7:40 in the morning, being told that Lawrence, who needed me to define retention rate, was going to stand in front of the Henderson executives and take credit for 4 years of my work, something shifted. Not rage. I want to be clear about that. It wasn't hot, it was cold. It was the very clear, very quiet understanding that I had been patient long enough. I went back to my desk. I sent one email to my husband, just the words, "I think it's time." Then I opened the Henderson deck and kept working on it, because that's who I am. I was not going to let that presentation fall apart just because I was angry. Those clients deserved good work regardless of who ended up in the room. The next 3 weeks were interesting. On the surface, everything looked normal. I handed off the presentation lead to Lawrence with a professionalism that I'm genuinely proud of. I walked him through every slide, every talking point, every known concern the Henderson team had raised in previous conversations. I was thorough and I was generous, and I did not let my face show a single thing. Meanwhile, my husband quietly made 2 phone calls. The first was to the SEC's Office of the Whistleblower. The second was to a journalist at the Financial Times who covered regulatory compliance in mid-sized financial firms and had, as it happened, been sniffing around Courtwell's reporting practices for the better part of a year. Neither call was made in my name. Neither call mentioned me at all. On the day of the Henderson presentation, I wore my good blazer. I sat in the second row as a supporting team member, which is what Donovan had emailed to let me know my role would be. Lawrence stood at the front of the room. He had memorized the slides well enough. He stumbled twice on the projected ROI figures, and I watched the Henderson CFO write something in her notebook, and I did not offer to help. They did not sign that day. They asked for a follow-up meeting. They specifically requested in writing that the person who had been so helpful on the preliminary calls, that's how they phrased it in the email which I was CC'd on, be present for the follow-up. They meant me. Donovan called me into his office that afternoon. "The Henderson team is asking for you specifically," he said. He looked like he had swallowed something unpleasant. "I know," I said. "I read the email. I'm going to need you to take a more active role going forward." I looked at him. What changed? He cleared his throat. "This is a big account. We need everyone contributing at their highest level." "Of course," I said. "I'm happy to help." He thought that was the end of it. It was not close to the end of it. The SEC inquiry became public knowledge on a Thursday, 4 days after the Henderson presentation. It was a preliminary inquiry, the kind of thing that gets a 1-paragraph mention in trade publications, but at a company the size of Courtwell, a 1-paragraph mention was enough to make the phone start ringing. The general counsel's office went quiet in the way that offices go quiet when everyone inside them is suddenly very busy doing things they don't want to explain. The FT article ran the following Monday. It was careful and sourced, and it did not name anyone directly, but it described the pattern of the reporting irregularities in enough detail that anyone familiar with Courtwell's internal structure would know exactly which department it was referring to, which was not the analytics division, which was specifically the department that Donovan had come from before his lateral hire. I found out later that 3 different people had forwarded the article to HR within the first hour of it going live. By Wednesday, Donovan was on administrative leave. I want to be honest about how I felt when I found out. It wasn't triumphant. It was quieter than that. I was at my desk eating a sandwich, and my phone buzzed with a text from a colleague that just said, "Did you see?" And I looked at it for a second, finished chewing, and then went back to the follow-up deck for Henderson. Because the work still needed to get done. That part never changes. The Henderson contract closed 3 weeks later. $4.2 million just like projected. The firm's regional director sent a company-wide email praising the analytics team's exceptional client relationship work. He mentioned Lawrence by name. He did not mention me. I saved that email, not out of bitterness, out of documentation. Because here is what happened next, and I need you to understand the sequence of it. 6 weeks after the Henderson close, I was called into a meeting with HR and the regional director. I assumed it was a routine performance review. I brought a printed copy of my quarterly metrics because I always come prepared. It was not a performance review. The General Counsel's office had, in the process of the SE query, done a full audit of the analytics division's work product over the previous 3 years. They had been looking for evidence that the reporting irregularities had touched my department's outputs. They had not found that. What they had found instead was a clear and documented record of whose work had actually produced the division's results. Mine. Not as a guess, as a verified time-stamped version-controlled record across 4 years of shared drive activity, email chains and client correspondence. The regional director sat across from me and said, "We owe you an apology." I uncapped my pen and set it next to my printed metrics. "I'm listening," I said. They offered me Donovan's position. They also offered to backdate the title change by 6 months and adjust my compensation accordingly, retroactively, because the General Counsel had advised them that failing to do so created certain liabilities they prefer to avoid. I accepted. I negotiated the terms carefully and I did not feel rushed, and I signed nothing in that meeting. I took the documents home, had my husband review them, and returned with 2 modifications, both of which they accepted without argument. Lawrence, for what it's worth, was not fired. He moved to a different team. We occasionally passed each other in the hallway, and he always licked slightly to the left of my face, which I find quietly satisfying. I want to tell you what I've learned because I think it matters. I spent a long time believing that if I just did the work, if I was thorough enough, documented enough, patient enough, the right people would eventually see it. And I don't think that's entirely wrong. Documentation did matter. The work did matter. But what also mattered was that I stopped waiting for permission to protect myself. Donovan was not a powerful man. He was an insecure one. The difference matters because insecure people in positions of authority are dangerous specifically because they mistake control for competence. They will reorganize, rename, restructure, and reassign until the people who actually know things are too exhausted and too demoralized to fight back. And then they will take credit for the survival of whatever is left. I was 30 years old when I became a department head. My team knew what had happened, more or less. These things are never truly secret. On my first day in the new role, my colleague who had texted me the day Donovan left stopped by my desk and said, without any particular fanfare, "It's about time." Then she went back to her spreadsheet. That was enough. That was genuinely enough. My husband made dinner that night, his grandmother's roast chicken recipe, which he reserves for occasions he considers worth marking, and we ate at the kitchen table with the good plates, the ones we usually save for guests. We didn't talk about Courtwell or Donovan or the SEC inquiry or the $4.2 million contract. We talked about a road trip we'd been vaguely planning for 2 years and whether we should finally book it. We booked it the following weekend, 2 weeks in the Pacific Northwest, Oregon coast mostly, the kind of places where the fog rolls in off the water in the morning and everything smells like cedar and salt. On the last evening, sitting on the porch of a rented cabin outside Cannon Beach with a glass of wine and the sound of the ocean about a quarter-mile away, I thought about Donovan. Not with anger, with something closer to pity almost. He was a man who had spent his career arranging things to make himself look bigger, and in doing so, he had put himself directly in the path of his own undoing. That had nothing to do with me. I had just declined to get out of the way. The Henderson account is still one of our firm's top 5 relationships. I manage it personally. The CFO, the one who had written in her notebook during Lawrence's stumbling presentation, became someone I genuinely respect. We have lunch twice a year. She told me once, over salads in Midtown, that she had known in the follow-up meeting that I was the one who had built the thing, just from how precisely I answered her questions. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" she asked. I thought about it for a second. I was being professional, I said. She laughed, really laughed, the kind that surprises even the person doing it. "And I think that's the truest thing I can tell you. There is a version of being professional that is just a way of asking women to be silent while they're being diminished. I was very good at that version for a very long time. I am not interested in it anymore. The work still gets done. The results still speak. But I decide now who gets to take credit for them. And the answer, for the first time in my career, is the right one. I keep thinking about that Tuesday morning. The flat grey sky, the empty office, the way Donovan set his phone face down on the table like that meant something. Like that small performance of attention was supposed to make what he was about to say feel reasonable. It didn't, but I let him finish anyway. That restraint, that choice to stay quiet and stay present and not flip the table, wasn't weakness. I understand that now in a way I didn't fully understand then. There's a version of staying calm that comes from fear, from not wanting to make things worse, from years of being told that a woman who pushes back is difficult. And then there's a version that comes from knowing exactly what we're doing. I'd like to think, by that Tuesday I had finally crossed over into the second one. What I've come to believe is that outcomes like mine don't come from luck or from some invisible force balancing the scales. They come from the accumulation of choices, small, unglamorous, often invisible choices, made over a long period of time. I documented everything, not because I was planning revenge, but because I believed the work deserved a record. I built real relationships with clients, not because I was strategizing, but because I actually cared whether they got good results. I told my husband the truth about what was happening at work, not as a move in a chess game, but because that's what you do when you trust someone completely. Every one of those choices compounded. When the moment came, there was something solid underneath me to stand on. Donovan made choices too. He chose a shortcut, lateral hire, borrowed authority, reorganized credit, over the slower and harder work of actually building something. And shortcuts have a physics to them. They feel efficient right up until the moment they don't. The SEC inquiry didn't come from nowhere. The FT article didn't come from nowhere. They came from a years-long pattern of decisions that Donovan had made long before I ever walked into that building. I just happened to be in a position, when it mattered, to not stand in the way of those decisions catching up to him. I think a lot about what it actually takes to get through something like this with your integrity intact. Not your reputation, that's a different thing, and frankly a less important one. Integrity. The willingness to do the work correctly even when someone else is going to take credit for it. The willingness to be honest about what's happening even when honesty is inconvenient. The willingness to sit in discomfort and keep going rather than take the easy exit of bitterness or sabotage. I had moments where I wanted to take that exit. I won't pretend otherwise, but something in me kept choosing the longer road. And I think that's the thing worth saying out loud. The longer road is not a punishment. It is the thing itself. The patience, the precision, the refusal to compromise the work even when the work isn't being credited. That's not just how you survive situations like mine, that's how you become someone who doesn't get permanently derailed by them. Donovan could remove me from a presentation. He could not remove 4 years of documented, time-stamped, version-controlled proof of what I actually built. That proof existed because of how I had chosen to work every single day, long before I knew I would ever need it. The Henderson CFO asked me why I hadn't spoken up sooner. I said I was being professional, and she laughed. But the fuller answer is that I was also still figuring out the difference between patience and passivity. I know the difference now. Patience is strategic. It accumulates. It waits for the moment when what you've built quietly and carefully becomes impossible to ignore. Passivity just waits and hopes. I stopped hoping somewhere around that Tuesday morning. I started knowing. And knowing, turns out, is a much better place to stand.